So now we did add static generation and server-side rendering to this mini application here. What about client-side data fetching though? Do we need that as well? To be honest, in this application, I would argue that we don't really need it. But we could still add it on a page where I think that it would also be okay. And that's this filter page. There we are currently using get server-side props. That works, but I think here client-side data fetching could also be okay. By using that, the page would load a bit quicker because we don't need to pre-render it on the server, but of course therefore the data would initially be missing. So we need to show some loading state until the data is there. But I think this page would be a fine page for client-side data fetching because it might be nice to get to this page quickly. And in addition, it's not that important for search engines. I mean, this filtered list of events, that's not the main thing search engines should be crawling. For them, the featured events, all events, and the event details are more relevant. So therefore, I think we could use client-side data fetching here on that filtered events page. That does not mean that you typically replace get server-side props with client-side data fetching. It just happens to fit in quite well in this exact scenario. Therefore, in this Slack page, I'll comment this code here back in, because now for client-side data fetching, we again need access to the route parameters inside of this component function, because that is where we are going to write that data fetching code. And we definitely, for example, still need some loading state, which should eventually be displayed. Now I want to do the data fetching with this use SWR hook, which I showed you in the last course section. So I'll quit the development server temporarily and install the SWR package, which brings us that hook. And thereafter, we can restart the development server. Now here in the Slack page, we can import use SWR from this SWR package, and then we can start using it. Here, after I got my filter data, so after I got the route parameters, I will call use SWR, and then we want to send a request. And I want to send a request to Firebase for filtered events. Now again, we can add that filtering logic with Firebase, but since it's not the focus here, I'll cheat and I will instead fetch all events and then filter here in this component, which is of course suboptimal, but good enough for this example. So therefore, again, I'll grab this link, which fetches all events, and use that as that key for use SWR. And that then, as you learned, gives us back an object where we get access to the fetched data and also to a possible error we might be getting. Now, we also still need to transform the data though. That doesn't change. This transformation still needs to be applied. So therefore, I'll copy that transformation logic and add it to this Slack page with help of useEffect, which we need to import from React. And whilst we're there, we can also already import useState because we'll need that as well. So now here, after using use SWR, I'll execute useEffect and pass an effect function to it. And as a dependency, I'll add data, because this effect should rerun whenever the data we fetched changes. Then I'll check if we do have data, because if we don't, there's nothing we need to do. And if we do have data, I want to transform it. So I paste in my transformation logic to transform the incoming data into such an events array. However, that array should not be returned here. Instead, it should be set as state. So we can register some state here, which is initially undefined, the events state, with set events as a state updating function. And then in here, I'll call set events and set this equal to my events which I have here. So to this events array, not the events state. In case this is confusing, I can also name this loaded events and set loaded events. And then down there set loaded events equal to the events array we're generating here. Now, of course, it's very possible that we don't have any loaded events, especially when this component is rendered for the first time, so before fetching data has even started. So if we not have loaded events, then I want to show this loading output here. Otherwise, we make it past this if check, and then in this case, we get the filtered year and month, we convert that, and we can then use that data to extract just the events which we want to display here. Again, that is suboptimal. Normally, we would want to fetch just the right events, but since this would be very Firebase specific, we're going to go with this approach here. So therefore here, I then want to use my filtering logic here from inside the getFilteredEvents function in API util, copy that over and add it here so that I have my filtered events here. And instead of all events, that's loaded events. So this state we just added, that will then filter the events appropriately. However, here, I don't want to compare this with year, but with num year, and here with num month. So with these two constants. Now we get the filtered events. Props has error will never be a thing since we're not using server-side rendering anymore, which is where this prop was coming from before. Now we won't use that anymore. I'll soon remove it. So that's no longer something we should check. Instead here, I want to bring back this if check, which we outsourced to get server-side props. Since we're moving back to client-side data fetching, I'll bring it back onto the client side. So this is my if condition now. Like this. And it might make sense to check this before we try to filter. So I'll grab this code here and actually check this here before we derive the filtered events. So if we make it past this check, we can filter for events. We no longer need that line now. And then we check if we do have filtered events, or to be precise, if we don't have filtered events, in which case we show this fallback. And otherwise, we still want to display the filtered events. And down there, we can now again use num year and num month, since I brought back those values here. So with all of that, we should be fetching the data on the client side with the use SWR hook. Now here we might have an error, so that's also something, this error, this HTTP error, which we might be getting, which we should consider. And I'll simply check here, or if we have an error, then I want to show this error output. Of course, you could also handle it separately. And with all that added, we brought client-side data fetching back. And that means, of course, that we should now remove get server-side props. Having both together doesn't make a lot of sense. It can make sense to have get static props with client-side fetching so that you have some pre-rendered page and you then update it with client-side fetching. But get server-side props and client-side fetching makes no sense because get server-side props is re-executed for every request anyways. So you are guaranteed to have the latest data there. So if you use client-side data fetching, as we are doing it here, it makes no sense to use that in conjunction with get server-side props. At least not if your concern is having up-to-date data. It could make sense if you need to look into request headers or anything like that, but we're not doing that here, so we can comment this out. And with all that, if we save all the code again, if I reload this page here for a filter where I have no events, I see that. If I enter something invalid, I see that. And if I do set a valid filter, I see that. And if I reload, I see loading and that. And of course, if we now inspect the page source, This page is now missing the event data. Instead, it only contains that loading text. Because when it was pre-rendered, we didn't pre-fetch the data, we didn't prepare the data for the pre-rendering, since I commented out get server-side props. And therefore, all Next.js saw when it pre-rendered this page was in the end this loading state. This here, because we don't have any loaded events the first time this component is rendered by Next.js. Now, as explained, using client-side data fetching is totally optional here. There's nothing wrong with get server-side props, but now we also saw that in action again, and therefore hopefully it's now clear how those different data fetching approaches work and when you might want to consider using which.